The 29 worst neighbourhoods in Toronto to immigrate to. There are 140 official neighbourhoods in Toronto, and many other unofficial and semi-official neighbourhoods among them, and not all are created equal. Information has been drawn primarily from CBC's Interactive Crime Map, the Globe and Mail's Home Price Estimate, and Toronto's Life 2013 Neighbourhood Rankings. The ranking is our own, and totally arbitrary. We're still fighting about it. 29. Yonge-Eglinton. Yonge-Eglinton is one of the most in-demand neighbourhoods in the city, but because of that it's extremely expensive. Average house prices rose from a ridiculous $900,000 in 2011 to a ludicrous $1 million in 2015. And it is home to the busiest subway station in the city that isn't a terminal or interchange. Where can you find the infamous P stairs? Its northwest exit, which never stops smelling like urine, and the bus terminal, which wasn't supposed to be permanent, which smells almost as bad. It's odd that one of the city's trendiest neighbourhoods would be home to perhaps its worst public transit experience. But this is Toronto we are talking about. 28. The Bridle Path, Path-Sunnybrook-York Mills. The Bridle Path is so expensive, the Globe didn't even bother with listing its average house price. York Mills is one of the neighbourhoods it's lumped in with, has an average house price of $2.6 million as of 2016. That's just plain ridiculous. And that's the cheap part of the neighbourhood. These neighbourhoods are near nothing but golf courses and hospitals, so it's pretty great if you're an old rich person. I mean, if you were dropping $2.6 million on a house, we'd want to live in Rosedale, where prices are actually falling. We didn't say reasonable, or something. Seriously, we'd only live here if my salaried chauffeur drove us everywhere. 27. The Junction. The Junction is so trendy right now. There are breweries, bakeries, hipster bars, restaurants, a music festival, and overpriced natural food stores, as well as the West Toronto rail path, recycled train tracks for helmeted, smug urban cyclists. But the area still isn't quite as gentrified as some would have you believe it. It's still full of dollar stores, and the no frills is still there. A sure sign the rich haven't quite taken over yet. While housing prices have dropped in the past years, and homeintelligent.ca lists the average home price as $373,258, nearly every listing the site currently provides is well over $500,000. If you move here, you have to suffer hipsters, renovated warehouses, and volatile real estate prices, as well as urban coyotes lurking in nearby High Park. Ugh. 26. West Hill. The grid tells us you can live here if you can't afford the Kingsway. Do people want to live in the Kingsway? But a place like West Hill is practically a suburb and begs the question, if you want to live in a major city such as Toronto, why would you want to live as far away as West Hill? Rouge also begs this question, and the Elms, and so many other neighbourhoods. Seriously, why not just live in Pickering? You're barely adding to that already unfortunate commute, and you're likely to find an area just as nice or nicer. 25. University. In 2011, the neighbourhood around the University of Toronto was not a safe place, apparently. The neighbourhood was second in sexual assaults, third in drug offences, seventh in break-in and entries and robberies, and eighth in assaults. In 2013, Toronto Life rated the neighbourhood 97th out of 140. We have to disagree a little bit with the previous pessimism. The next-door neighbourhood we know well, Palmerston, Little Italy, is supposed to be one of the 25th best in the city. It's as if there's an invisible line going down Bathurst Street. To the west is the wonderful Palmerston, and to the east is the depraved, crime-infested University. That doesn't correspond to our experience of the two neighbourhoods being pretty much identical, except there are even more students in University than Palmerston, Little Italy, and fewer Korean restaurants. For Toronto Life, the problem was apparently the lack of elementary and secondary schools, and average rankings for all the other categories. Oh, and diversity. University sucks on diversity. That's a metaphor. Please. But the only reasons I can see for not wanting to live there are the high rent and the crime statistics, of which we are sceptical. As the latest report shows, less crime in the hood. In 2015, Toronto Life ranked at 12 out of 140, with a much better crime ranking, so maybe things have changed. 24. Bedford Park-Nortown. Toronto Life ranked this area 33 in their latest ranking, way down from the 16th best neighbourhood to live in, when they surveyed all 140 neighbourhoods back in 2013. What happened? Transit was ranked a lowly 18.3 out of 100, yet it has the Yonge and St. Lawrence lines next door. The area is rich and secluded. I guess that's why it was the neighbourhood with the most reported break-ins in 2011. Now, baby, that's just because everybody's rich. But this is like living in a suburbia, without the cheaper houses. In 2016, Realosophy.com listed the average home price at $1,000,004. Do you want to pay that much to live near the Lawrence subway? Keep in mind that Bedford Park-Nortown is a weird hybrid, including part, but not all of the traditional Bedford Park, and an even smaller part of Nortown. Some might argue it doesn't even include Nortown, so all the numbers are kind of skewed. Lambton-Baby Point. Lambton-Baby Point, pronounced Babby Point, they'll have you know, is one of the oddest neighbourhoods in the city, in part because it really is multiple neighbourhoods. Lambton was the murder capital of Toronto in 2011. But Toronto Life's latest ranking now has it as one of the city's safest neighbourhoods. Strange. But overall it still ranks a poor 82. It also has a correspondingly low average housing price, a modest $551,000, a few years back drawn up, no doubt, by Babby Point's ridiculous housing prices. But this only applies to the area outside of Babby Point, because of course Babby Point is one of Toronto's most exclusive neighbourhoods. Toronto Life was rather hard on the area, in part because you have to drive or take the bus pretty much always if you want to buy anything not available in a convenience store. And there are only a couple of schools actually in the neighbourhood. There is also a really stark divide down Jane Street, with the east side being the poor Lambton, with its homicide, heavy past, and then Babby Point all tucked away on the west side with its pompous gates. 22. Stonegate-Queensway. This neighbourhood is no longer highly regarded by Toronto Life, from 18th overall in 2013 all the way down to 83 in their latest ranking. But it has seen a slew of break-ins each summer since 2012, in which a man attempts to molest elderly women in the early morning, or just steal stuff. Probably not the same dude, but anyway. So I guess if you're an elderly woman and you live alone, do not live in Stonegate, unless you're hoping for a freaky younger boyfriend. 21. The Club District, Entertainment District, one of the waterfront communities. For some reason, much of the downtown area nearest to the lake is lumped into something called waterfront communities, which also includes the island. This U-shaped neighbourhood includes Toronto's infamous Club District, where people are shot all the time for being in line at the wrong nightclub, or something. But to make it so much worse, the waterfront communities are insanely expensive. The average price a few years ago was listed by the Globe as only $510,394, but we are talking about condos. Who wants to pay $500,000 for something nobody is going to want to buy in 8 years? Condos can depreciate, unlike most houses in Toronto, where even teardowns can sell for ridiculous prices, and they can have all kinds of hidden costs down the road, which you would only expect from a house. As energy prices rise, living in a glass-covered condo could become very expensive, costly, and shootings? Sounds like a wonderful place. 20. Rouge. Rouge is a giant neighbourhood in northeast Scarborough. It is literally as far as you can get from downtown Toronto without leaving the city limits. Toronto Life rated Rouge the 132nd best neighbourhood in Toronto, a big fall since earlier ranking. Although it's ridiculous to call this area the size of a large town a neighbourhood, it is a neighbourhood that apparently prizes proximity to the Toronto Zoo over proximity to the core. By the way, living in smelling distance of the zoo must be awesome. The Globe did not include any of the actual Rouge neighbourhood in its most recent survey of housing prices, so we can't tell you how bad the prices are. But you might as well live in Pickering. At least that way, you're near a GO station. 19. New Toronto. New Toronto is being sold as a cheaper alternative to the beach, but crime was still a major issue as recently as 2011, and the area is poorly connected to downtown, where most of the jobs are unless you drive, and then it's really close, when the Gardiner is functioning, that is. Toronto Life ranked the neighbourhood at 85 out of 140 in 2015, in contrast to the Grid's rosier view. It's a good place if you're a college student. Humber is right there. But otherwise it's hard to see the appeal. Isn't this pretty much Mississauga? 18. York University Heights. Toronto Life liked York University Heights in 2013, rating it 32nd out of 140 neighbourhoods, only knocking it for the rampant crime that has long been a major problem. Not so in the latest survey, where it's down to 119. Crime is still a problem, but transit, shopping, schools and healthcare all rank low to lousy. The ratio of apartments to houses is so great that the Globe did not include the area on its survey of housing prices. It really only makes sense to live there if you work or study at York University, because there's not much else there, and it's practically Vaughan. Like so many of the communities on the fringes of Toronto, from a financial perspective, it might make more sense to move across the border at Steeles, where your property taxes will be substantially lower. In this case, Vaughan's rate is about 1/3 of Toronto's. 17. Yorkdale-Glen Park. The area below the infamous Yorkdale shopping centre had bad crime problems when CBC publicised Toronto's crime stats in 2011. First in stolen cars, second in robberies, fifth in major thefts. Crime is still a problem in the latest Toronto Life rankings. The mall has seen its share of incidents, shootings year after year, and other strange incidents, such as a man running through the mall with a knife and a scream mask. And the mall likely serves as a magnet for visitors that the neighbourhood may not otherwise want. But according to the Toronto Life, that's pretty much the only serious drawback, as otherwise the neighbourhoods did fairly average in their rankings, 77th out of 140. 16. Bay Street Corridor. If you looked at the crime numbers alone, you'd think the corridor, the heart of downtown, from Bloor to Front and University to Yonge, was the worst place to live in the entire city. In 2011, it was the first in assaults and robberies, third in sexual assaults and major thefts, 10th in B&Es, and 6th in drug offences. The only serious crime category for which it didn't feature in the top 10 were murders and car thefts. But this being the busiest area of the city, and the rates, which are calculated in per 10,000 residents, are exaggerated in a neighbourhood that gets more visitors than pretty much any other section of the city. If the corridor didn't have the highest rates of crime compared to the rest of the city, that would be remarkable. The neighbourhood was ranked 21st in 2015, all the way from 82nd out of 140 by Toronto Life in 2013. It's still getting killed on crime, but has improved in other areas like schools. The condo prices are also crazy. The only reason to live there is accessibility. If you live in the corridor, you are at the intersection of both major subway routes and near many, if not most, of the corporate headquarters located in Toronto. You can probably walk to your job if you work downtown, so that's something. 15. Church-Yonge Corridor. The Church-Yonge Corridor is popular with students because of the location of Ryerson at the heart of it, and it's the home of the one side of Toronto's gay village, but the area has its share of crime problems, and if the real estate prices are any indication, an average price of barely over $410,000 a few years ago, nobody wants to live here. That's a bit of a shock, given how close it is to downtown. But we have to remember that it also borders some of the worst neighbourhoods in the old city: Moss Park, Regent Park, St Jamestown. This is actually a neighbourhood we have considered living in multiple times, so it's honestly not that terrible. But every apartment you see is usually a dump and ridiculously expensive. 14. Elms-Old Rexdale. The Elms or Old Rexdale had the most major thefts of any neighbourhood in 2011. This isn't a surprise to anyone from Toronto, as Rexdale has long been notorious for gang-related crime. Toronto Life rated the neighbourhood at 112 out of 140 in the city because of, among other things, a lack of access to public transit, schools and shopping. The advantage is that it's one of the cheapest places to buy in Toronto. But that's because Rexdale is in the middle of nowhere, as far as the city is concerned. North Etobicoke is almost as far as you can get from downtown without leaving the city limits. Almost. Northeastern Scarborough, i.e. Rouge, is even farther. 13. Blake Jones. Drive east past Pape on the Danforth and everything changes. Greektown ends and something else replaces it. This is where we last lived in Toronto, and we actually quite liked it. Toronto Life ranked it 116th out of 140 in 2013, because apparently the environment is bad. We hadn't noticed. And there is very little diversity. The latest survey has boosted it to 48th, mostly because of affordable housing. But though Blake Jones didn't feature it in the top worst 10 neighbourhoods in the major crime categories in 2011, it was among the top 20 to 50 in most of them, although according to Toronto Life, the crime seems to be getting better. The rising crime rate had been blamed in part on the horrible youth unemployment rate, over 33% at one point. But what makes Blake Jones a bad destination is simple. Even though gentrification doesn't seem to have arrived from Greektown yet, and even though crime is kind of bad and the kids can't find jobs, the housing prices are still rising like crazy. The average cost of a house in Blake Jones was a laughable $710,000. These prices are driven by the micro neighbourhood, the pocket, which is aggressively trying to establish a unique identity, even though it's merely a stone's throw from the Blake Street projects. This supposedly a bad neighbourhood. What are we to do when even the bad neighbourhoods are expensive? 12. Glenfield-Jane Heights. Jane Heights is the pleasant name Toronto officially gives to the infamous Jane and Finch area, once the most feared neighbourhood in all of Toronto. The Globe and Mail, in its housing price estimates, includes the area in a much larger area called Aaliyah, which had an average house price of just below $310,000, or very, very, very low for Toronto. Is Glenfield bringing the rest of Aaliyah down, or are things better than they used to be? The answer apparently is that things have changed. Toronto Life somehow listed the place as the 33rd best neighbourhood in 2013. But as recently as 2002, this may have been the worst place in the city, with even basic city services not accessible to 30% of residents. Now the neighbourhood has slipped back down to 114 out of 140, and crime is still very much a problem. Though the neighbourhood is still stigmatised by its history, and it's still too far from the downtown to really be convenient, whether Jane and Finch is one of the worst places to live in Toronto or not is an open question. 11. Mount Dennis. In 2013, Toronto Life named Mount Dennis the worst neighbourhood in Toronto. It's now improved, all the way to 93 out of 140. Wow! One of us actually grew up not far from Mount Dennis and was a little surprised that the place he learned to drive in was now considered absolutely the worst place to live in the city. The reasoning: few and poor schools, no jobs, you have to travel to shop, there's nothing to do, and the housing prices are really low. The housing prices are really low. That's a bad thing? People usually take low housing prices as perhaps the strongest indicator of a neighbourhood's desirability, and in the case of Mount Dennis, it doesn't get much cheaper. The Globe estimated the average housing price in Mount Dennis at under $375,000. That's cheaper than many suburbs. Of course, in terms of public transit, Mount Dennis is practically the suburbs. 10. Etobicoke West Mall, aka Eatonville. Whether you call it the West Mall or Eatonville, this area is super far down from downtown. There's a massive highway running through the middle of it. It's so noisy, and there's just not a lot to do, unless you love hanging out at the Cloverdale Mall. Also, it's somehow gotten expensive. Toronto Life was really tough on this area in 2015, ranking it 121st in the city, and faulting it for its lack of schools, community engagement, entertainment, and shopping options, access to transit, and its confusing housing market. 9. Brookhaven-Amesbury. Amesbury, the most dangerous place to be a woman in 2011, as it led the city in sexual assaults. It also came 8th in auto theft. In 2015, Toronto Life had little nice to say about the neighbourhood, ranking it the 92nd in Toronto, due to few schools, poor housing conditions, little community engagement, and a host of other factors which the neighbourhood fared poorly on, including fairly high levels of crime. Also, they forgot to mention that for Toronto, this neighbourhood is in the middle of nowhere. If you can tell me what's of interest at Black Creek and Lawrence, I'm all ears. At least Amesbury has a disproportionate number of parks. Seriously, this is in the middle of nowhere. 7. Maple Leaf and Rustic. The city and Toronto Life consider these two places separate entities, but the Globe doesn't even acknowledge their existence. They are both lumped into Downs View for their purposes. TL ranked these two places as the 118th and 98th neighbourhoods respectively, and they got hit for similar reasons. Few schools, nothing to do, far from everything. Housing prices for all of the Globe's definition of Downs View have dropped recently, but we don't know if that's a reflection specifically on these neighbourhoods. It may well be. Though TL didn't note it, both neighbourhoods have had some crime problems over the years, just as the surrounding area has, and that likely has a lot to do with why people don't want to move here. 6. Beechborough-Greenbrook, aka Silverthorn. Named the third worst neighbourhood in the city by Toronto Life in 2013. The area has improved, according to Toronto Life, in their 2015 survey, all the way up to 62nd. Seems that the perception of this area, one of the numerous bad neighbourhoods around Black Creek Drive in the city's northwest corner, has clearly changed since 2013. Housing prices have risen in the last few years. We're not sure the reasons it was rated so poorly have actually disappeared. Toronto Life noted it wasn't convenient, which it still isn't, and they also noted that there's nothing to do there, and there still isn't. But clearly people have come around to the idea of living here, over the surrounding areas, so it seems not as bad as they thought. That being said, it was still rated the third worst place to live in Toronto just a few years ago, by a magazine that should know. 5. Weston. This neighbourhood was particularly poorly regarded, currently because of the 24-hour construction for the now renovated Weston GO station and the newly opened Union to Pearson route, which ended in 2015, after previously being assured it would end in 2014. And of course, it's far away from everything to boot, and TL has rated it 96th in their latest ranking. True, it is now a little less inconvenient seeing the construction has finally finished. In the past few years, at the height of the construction, houses were hitting the market like nobody's business. One eyewitness reported 10 houses for sale on a single street. The neighbourhood also has a crack problem and offers a delightful view of the Humber, which in the summertime often smells like garbage. 4. Moss Park. Moss Park is one of the city's legendary projects, legendary only among Torontonians. However, its reputation is probably far worse than the reality. Like so many of the formerly dangerous neighbourhoods of Toronto, Moss Park has experienced some gentrification recently, and the areas around it are particularly more in demand than they used to be. The housing project itself and the immediate area around it are still quite poor, and the place is still not exactly the safest area in the city, listed as the second worst place for assaults and the worst for drug offences in 2011. Also, it feels like this neighbourhood has far more than its fair share of homeless shelters. Toronto Life ranked Moss Park 96th out of 140 in 2013, citing the crime rate, the lack of schools, and the environment as 3 reasons not to live there. For some reason, it's not in the 2015 rankings, maybe swallowed up by a neighbourly neighbourhood. There's even talk of Moss Park being the next battleground for gentrification. 3. Flemingdon Park. Flemingdon Park is one of Toronto's most notorious neighbourhoods and contains one of Toronto's most violent high schools. The lack of desirability of this area of Toronto is perhaps best indicated by the housing prices, an unbelievable average of $190,000 in the spring of 2014. This has a lot to do with the lack of actual physical housing in the area and the large number of apartment buildings, which has to be the lowest in the city. Toronto Life ranked it 110th out of 140, and that's primarily because of the lack of homes and the lack of businesses to employ people in the immediate area. But on a personal level, we can't think of anywhere else in the city we'd less like to live. It's far from everything we care about except the Science Centre. And it's not safe. 2. North St Jamestown. For reasons that elude us, St Jamestown has been split into 2 neighbourhoods by the city, North St Jamestown and Cabbagetown, South St Jamestown. This odd division boosts ratings of the lower half of the area, one of the poorest in the city. St Jamestown wasn't always this way. Once it was the trendiest place in Toronto. It was all swingers and excitement, and then people didn't actually want to move there, and now you have a slum. Check out this wonderful description from Wikipedia. Emphasis ours. St Jamestown is the largest high-rise community in Canada. It has been identified as one of the 13 economically deprived neighbourhoods within the city. It consists of 19 high-rise buildings, 14 to 32 stories. These massive residential towers were built in the 1960s. Officially, approximately 17,000 people live in the neighbourhood. 19 apartment towers and 4 low-rise buildings, but the number is thought by residents to be 25,000, making it Canada's most densely populated community and one of the most densely popular neighbourhoods anywhere in North America. Don't you just want to move there, like right now? 1. Regent Park. Toronto Life ranked Regent Park the 11th worst neighbourhood in the city in 2013, and that should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the area. But apparently its revitalisation project, which will cost billions, has boosted its latest ranking to 71st. We can't tell you the average housing price because Regent Park is one of Toronto's most notorious projects. Originally designed as not a permanent housing development, but as a transitional area where the poor were supposed to live only until they got back on their feet. However, the opposite happened, and Regent Park became one of the poorest areas in the city, which it remains to this day. There are ongoing efforts to make the area nicer, with the redevelopment now underway, or at least more physically similar to the surrounding areas of Cabbagetown, Moss Park, and Treffan Court. There are a few private homes, no schools in the actual neighbourhood, and obviously there are very few jobs. But there are a few condos with more to come. Don't you just love it?